Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. I'm a little early today because the prayer breakfast for Des Moines is at 7:30, and so I just thought I'd get on a little early. We're reading from Leviticus chapter 11. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, "Tell the Israelites, you may eat all these kinds of land animals. You may eat any animal with divided hooves, hooves, and that chews the cud. But among the ones that chew the cud or have divided hooves, how do you say that word? Anyway, you are not to eat these." Good morning, Janet. The camel, though it chews the cud, does not have divided hooves. It is unclean for you. The hyrax, though it chews the cud, does not have hooves. It is unclean for you. The hare, that's the rabbit, though it chews the cud, does not have hooves. It is unclean for you. The pig, though it has divided hooves, does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you. Good morning, Stacy. Do not eat any of their meat or touch their carcasses, for they are unclean for you. This is what you may eat from all that is in the water. You may eat anything in the water that has fins and scales, whether in the sea or streams. But these are to be detestable to you. Everything in the seas or streams that does not have fins and scales, among all the swarming things and other living creatures in the water, they are to remain detestable to you. You must not eat any of their meat, and you must not eat their carcasses, and you must detest their carcasses. Everything in the water that does not have fins and scales will be detestable to you. You are to test these birds. They must not be eaten, because they are detestable: the eagle, the bearded vulture, the black vulture, the kite, any kind of falcon, any kind of raven, the ostrich, the short-eared owl, the gull, any kind of hawk, the little owl, the cormorant, the long-eared owl, the white owl, the desert owl, the osprey, the stork, any kind of heron, the hoopoe, never heard of that in my life, and the bat. All winged insects that walk on all fours are to be detestable to you. But you may eat these kinds of winged insects that walk on all fours, those that have jointed legs above their feet for hopping on the ground. You may eat these: any kind of locust, katydid, cricket, and grasshopper. All other winged insects that have 4 feet are to be detestable to you. These will make you unclean. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean until evening, and whoever carries any of their carcass must wash their clothes and be unclean until evening. All animals that have hooves but do not have a divided hoof and do not chew their cud are unclean for you. Whoever touches them becomes unclean. All the 4-footed animals that walk on their paws are unclean for you. Whoever touches their carcasses will be unclean until evening. Anyone who carries their carcasses must wash their clothes, will be unclean until evening. They are unclean for you. These creatures that swarm on the ground are unclean for you: the weasel, the mouse, any kind of large lizard, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the common lizard, the skink, and the chameleon. These are unclean for you among all the swarming creatures. Whoever touches them when they are dead will be unclean until evening. When any of them dies and falls on anything, it becomes unclean. Any item of wood, clothing, leather, sackcloth, or any implement used for work, it is to be rinsed with water and will remain unclean until evening. Then it will be clean. Any of them that falls into a clay pot, everything it will become unclean. You must break it. Any edible food coming into contact with that unclean water will become unclean, and any drinkable liquid in any container will become unclean. Anything one of their carcasses falls on will become unclean. If it is an oven or stove, it must be smashed. If it is unclean, it will remain unclean for you. A spring or cistern containing water will remain clean, but someone who touches a carcass in it will become unclean. If one of their carcasses fall on any seed that is to be sown, it is clean. But if water has been put on the seed and one of their carcasses fall on it, it is unclean for you. Good morning, Bill. Good morning, Vicky. If any of the animals that you use for food dies, anyone who touches its carcass will be unclean until evening. Anyone who eats some of its carcass must wash his clothes and will be unclean until evening. Anyone who carries its carcass must wash his clothes and will be unclean until evening. All the creatures that swarm on the earth are detestable. They must not be eaten. Do not eat any of the creatures that swarm up on earth. Anything that moves on its belly or walks on all fours or are many feet, they are detestable. Do not become contaminated by any creature that swarms. Do not become unclean or defiled by them, for I am Yahweh your God. So you must consecrate yourself before You must consecrate yourself and be holy, because I am holy. You must not defile yourselves by any swarming creature that crawls on the ground. For I am Yahweh, who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. So you must be holy, because I am holy. This is the law concerning animals, birds, and living creatures that move in the water, and all creatures that swarm on the ground, in order to distinguish between the unclean and clean, between the animals that may not be eaten and those that may be eaten and those that may not be eaten. Well, this is always kind of a controversial passage for Christians, particularly because Christians tend to eat whatever they want. So I guess we should just stop and talk about, first of all, what does clean and unclean mean? It's clean and unclean. Here's how I understand it. My kind of, not cursory, but I don't know how deep I understand it, but I kind of think that clean, my best reading of it means clean means the most normal as God would define perfection. And unclean means what is less normal as God defines perfection. So God says this is the kind of animal that's the most normal for how it should have these kind of hooves and this kind of chews its cud. And those who don't have that are less, I'm using the word normal, even though that normal doesn't make it any clearer necessarily. But I think some people look at this and say, oh, it's sin or not sin. But notice there's no prescription for the people to have to give a sacrifice for this. In fact, they're unclean, which means they can't go to the temple. So it does separate them from the presence of God in that sense, because they can't go to the temple for making a sacrifice. But they don't have to make a sacrifice for eating these things. At least that's what it reads at this point. They're just unclean. So I ate something in the morning, I came in contact with something in the morning, and then by evening, I'm clean again, and I could go to the evening sacrifice. So just clearly, and then it becomes much more of a bigger deal. But they're really clear not to eat these things. Especially, let's look at the things that we eat, that I've eaten: the hare, the pig. I'm sure I've eaten ostrich. I've not eaten locust, katydid, cricket, or grasshopper, though they're all clean animals. So we have these things that we can eat, things that we cannot eat. And so this is, and you can see that they said don't eat bats. And I'm sure as I read that, I was like, I shouldn't have eaten bats, right? But you should have eaten pigs then. So don't be screaming about that if you're willing to eat a pig or pork, and don't scream about somebody else eating a bat. But these are good rules if you don't know what to eat and how to eat. Like, how did anyone know what was good or bad to eat? And this is maybe a good way if you're caught in a desert island or a foreign area, you don't know what you should eat. I think these are probably safe things that could be eaten, because God has kind of commanded those things that's okay to eat. Now we get in this conflict, because most Christians eat whatever they want to eat, right? So we have to look at a couple things. I'm going to just look at what I think Scripture says, and I know I have some Messianic friends or some Christian friends that are lean heavily, not towards, they lean more heavily into Judaism than I do, but that's okay. We're going to have differences of opinion on this one. So the first passage I'm thinking of, and I don't know how to find it right now. I think it's in John or Mark. And Jesus says all things are clean. And the script, and then the commentator, the gospel writer, says, and he was talking about food. And it's really a fascinating verse. So that's one thing. And so people have ways of dismissing that and saying that's not what Jesus meant. I think that's what Jesus meant. And then probably one more that's a little more confusing, but I want to look at it, is Acts chapter 10. And in Acts chapter 10, or probably chapter 9, I'm looking at it clearly. No, I'm right. It was chapter 10. And chapter 10, Peter's upstairs praying on the top of his house. And while he's praying, verse number 9, the next day, he was hungry. Peter went up to pray in the housetop about noon. Then he became hungry and wanted to eat. But while they were preparing something, he went into a visionary state. He saw heaven opened and an object that resembled a large sheet coming down, being lowered by its four corners to the earth. In it were all 4-footed animals and reptiles of the earth and the birds of the sky. Then a voice said to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "No, Lord," Peter said, "for I have never eaten anything common," look at that word, "and ritually unclean." Notice he never says sin here. Again, a second time, a voice said to him, "What God has made clean, you must not call common. That is not holy." This happened 3 times, and then the object was taken up to heaven. While Peter was deeply perplexed about what the vision he had seen might mean, why was he perplexed? Because this is going contrary. Why would God ever tell Peter to do something contrary to Torah? If Torah is eternal, why would God tell him to do something contrary? It doesn't make any sense at all. None of us would. This is not, A, we think it's not from God, or B, it's just to be too confusing. But it seems like Peter did not he knew it was from God. He did not say, "Oh, that must not be from God." He said, "That's from God, but I just don't know what it means," because God would never ask me to eat something unclean. The men who had been